Greetings from New Mexico in the United States of America. If you're watching this video, it means that our electronic connection has failed us, and you are now getting the pre-recorded version of my comments on the talks today. I'm sorry, I'm still in New Mexico and couldn't join you in Luxembourg, but, well, I'm sort of there. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump on in. You have a handout which has the slides I'm presenting today, and though it means my face looks kind of weird, like I'm sort of staring at the table, not you, that's the price of actually looking at the slides. So let's go ahead and begin. A quick overview, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about how to define and evaluate deliberative processes. That'll get us mostly into talking about what deliberation means, which we've already talked about a fair bit today. I'll juxtapose the papers in terms of the process and the findings they have. My goal here is to kind of step back from the specifics of the papers and look at the bigger picture. I'll then compare those processes with some others that I like to sometimes talk about in relation to conventional forms of deliberation. I think this will give us a broader sense of the range of things you can do with deliberative democracy. And then finally, I'm going to propose a few deliberative processes that might be useful for us to think about in the future. They're kind of speculative, but they're kind of my pet ideas at this point, I suppose. Before we do all that, I just want to point out that there's a website developing right now. Archon Fung at Harvard is heading this up, called participedia.org. And I encourage each of you to contribute a page to that on the processes you presented today. You can contact Archon directly or go to participedia.org to learn more about it. Fantastic project. And the problems we're dealing with today in terms of defining deliberation, thinking about income impacts and so on, those problems are incredibly serious at participedia.org. That's one of the biggest hurdles they face, is how to think systematically about those things across a wide range of processes. All right, let's start by thinking about different ways of assessing deliberation. In each of the presentations you heard today, there were different ideas about what needs to be assessed. I think everyone agrees that we're concerned about the quality of the deliberation, but then what else are we interested in? I'm going to boil that down a little bit. I'm leaving out a couple criteria like transparency that came up in some of the individual presentations. But here's the first one. And first and foremost, really, is inclusion. Are we really bringing into the process a broadly representative group? And here I want to emphasize two things. In the presentations, the emphasis is typically on whether the participants in a deliberative process represent the general population. I want to encourage us to also think about representation of viewpoints. In fact, I think sometimes we might even want to structure deliberative events with a little less concern for being demographically exact in our representativeness, and more concern for actually representing the range of voices, which might even mean oversampling some minority viewpoints so that you have a more balanced set of views being presented. Depends a little bit on what kind of an outcome you're looking for, but maybe we'll get back to this a little bit later. It's something to think about. Obviously, high-quality deliberation. I'll say more in the next slide about what I mean by that, and it resonates a bit with the different approaches presented today. And then finally, impact. Now, I want to distinguish some different impacts here. We have at least one presentation that was very interested in the impacts on the participants themselves, something I've been very interested in for years as well. Policy impact is, I think, sort of the holy grail here. It's the thing that a lot of deliberative scholars are interested in finding, is really solid examples of a deliberative process that has a strong policy impact. As we heard in the presentations today, that can be hard to find. Later in this presentation, I'll show you some examples of processes that can or should or will have that kind of impact. And finally, I don't want us to overlook something. This isn't talked about very much, but you can also think of deliberative events having an impact on the public, not necessarily on public policy, and on more than just the participants themselves. You could see a deliberative process maybe changing the voting choices people make, or the choices they make as consumers, maybe in relation to recycling, for instance. Those kinds of impacts are beyond policy, but are tremendously important. In some contexts, perhaps even more important, but I think they're often overlooked. All right, now in terms of defining deliberation, you heard a few different conceptions about what's important here. Let me just throw out my own criteria I've been using. In the book Political Communication and Deliberation, I elaborate on these in much more detail. But here we go. I think of deliberation as having an analytic and a social aspect. The analytic aspect is what kind of analysis on. This is what we think of when we think in terms of making arguments and exchanging reasons and the better argument prevailing. It's really about analysis. First thing is creating a solid information base. That's something obviously we try to do before the process begins in terms of mailing out brochures and pamphlets and so on. But it's also something that's happening in the course of the deliberation. And this shows up in some of the presentations when we think about how informed people's arguments are. Prioritizing the key values at stake doesn't actually really get much discussion in any of the presentations, and I think it's significantly overlooked. Research on group effectiveness, and now I'm talking about small groups generally, often shows that this is one of the things that is most overlooked in small groups, to back up and think about what are the values at play here. After all, an argument can be good in terms of using evidence, but it can also be good in terms of speaking directly to the most important values that are at play in the discussion. And if you don't talk about values at all, and you don't think about how to prioritize, say, equality versus liberty or whatever, you really have a limited discussion, and you've missed an important part of the analytic process. Another thing that I didn't see talked about in the presentations, but is tremendously important when we evaluate the analytic aspect of deliberation, is the range of solutions being considered. I think it's important not just to say whether the arguments are substantive and responsive to each other, but what is the larger field of policies or actions we're considering. The arguments could be very deliberative in relation to each other and in their internal content, but if they're only addressing a narrow slice of the potential solutions that are potentially on the political agenda, well then the process is failing in that respect. Weighing pros and cons and trade-offs is at the heart, I think, of things like the index you saw presented and other approaches to deliberation that emphasize argument. That's absolutely key. Here I would emphasize that, again, generalizing to small groups more broadly, it's the failure to think about the cons of a proposal that is most important. So if I had my ideal deliberative coding tool, I would want to be able to look not just at whether people, again, are making arguments, but whether those arguments are really addressing the cons of proposals as much or even more than they're addressing the positive qualities. In other words, arguing against things instead of just arguing for things. Now, the social process of deliberation is where we start to say democratic deliberation. This gets to how people treat each other. And the first of these criteria got mentioned in many presentations, the distribution of speaking opportunities. I want to underscore the word adequately distribute here. When Robert Dahl talks about democracy, he often uses the phrase equal and adequate, and that's what got me thinking about this in the first place. We emphasize equality. Everyone has an equal opportunity, but sometimes we need to think about whether those opportunities are adequate. One of the presentations referred to the fact that people only had 2 chances to speak and how truncated the whole process was. Well, that's a good example of when there just aren't adequate opportunities. Even if they're equal, the process can fail because they're not sufficient. Mutual comprehension and consideration are the 2 listening criteria. Do people really understand each other? Are they considering each other's different points of view? Important to deliberation, this relates to respect in some of the presentations. And finally, respect itself, I distinguish, just as in the index, listening is distinguished from sort of using naughty words to refer to each other. But that kind of rounds out the social process as I conceive it.